The notification sound was the same one she'd used for 3 years. Soft, unassuming, the kind of sound that meant nothing. Except tonight it meant everything. Baek Gyo-won sat at the head of a table that controlled the movement of more money than most governments see in a quarter. 7 men waited for him to finish his sentence. He had been mid-word when the phone lit up. He looked down. He read it once. Then he read it again. Your son is sick. Come now. No name. She didn't need one. There was only one person on this earth who still had that number. He stood up. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't explain. He simply stood, buttoned his jacket with the same steady hands that had never once trembled in 20 years of doing what he did, and walked out. The 7 men looked at each other. Not one of them said a word. Because in all the years they had worked for Baek Gyo-won, they had never seen him leave a room before a meeting was finished. They didn't know about the woman. They didn't know about the boy. They didn't know that somewhere in this city, the only thing Baek had never been able to control was lying in a hospital bed, small and quiet and sick. And the woman who swore she was done asking him for anything had just asked. Before we go any further, if you're new here, this channel is where we bring you the kind of love stories that stay with you. Real emotion. Real stakes. The kind of people you root for even when they're wrong. If that's what you came for, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand that text message, you have to understand what it cost her to send it. Amaria Sloan Ashwood was not a woman who asked for help. That was not stubbornness, not exactly. It was something older and more earned than that. She had grown up watching the women around her carry everything, silently, without applause, without acknowledgement, without anyone noticing the weight until it was finally too heavy and they dropped it. She had promised herself at 16 that she would never be the woman who needed rescuing. That she would build something so solid, so completely her own, that no one could take it from her and no one would ever need to give it back. For a long time, that worked. She was sharp-minded and warm in the way that catches people off guard, the kind of woman who could make you feel seen in 60 seconds and held at arm's length in 61. She had a laugh that filled rooms. She had opinions she wasn't afraid to defend. She had built a career from nothing, an apartment that was small but hers, a life that fit her like something she had sewn herself. And then she met Baek Gyo-won. Not through his reputation. Not through his money. She met him on an ordinary Tuesday, through a mutual acquaintance who didn't know what Baek actually did for a living, in a restaurant where he was simply a man at a table who looked up when she walked in and didn't look away. She had ignored it. He had been patient. She had tested him. He had not flinched. And somewhere in the months that followed, in the quiet spaces between the parts of his life she was not allowed to see, she had made the mistake of believing she understood him. She hadn't. But she had loved him anyway. Completely. Stubbornly. The way she did everything. And when she finally understood the full shape of the world she had walked into, when she understood what Malachi would grow up surrounded by if she stayed, she left. Quietly. Carefully. Without a scene, without a confrontation, without giving Baek the chance to talk her out of it. Because she knew he could. And she knew that if he did, she would stay. And staying would cost her son something she couldn't name yet but could already feel coming. So she packed what mattered. She took her boy. And she disappeared. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of night shifts and school runs. 3 years of Malachi asking questions she answered sideways. 3 years of a name she never said out loud, in a city that didn't know her history, building a life she controlled entirely. Except for the part of her that never stopped wondering whether she'd made the right call. And then Malachi collapsed. And the wondering stopped mattering. And Amaria Sloan Ashwood, who never asked for help, who left without looking back, who had spent 3 years being strong enough for 2 people, sat alone in a white hospital hallway at 2 in the morning and typed 7 words to the one person she swore she was finished with. Because her son mattered more than her pride. Because some decisions are bigger than the people making them. Because she was his mother. And mothers do what needs to be done. She hit send. She put the phone face down on her thigh. She closed her eyes. And she waited to see what kind of man he still was. Amaria had a theory about powerful men. She developed it young, watching the ones who moved through her mother's world, the deacons, the contractors, the self-made men who filled church basements with the particular energy of people who needed to be seen. Her theory was simple. The louder a man was about his power, the less secure he was inside it. Real power, she believed, was quiet. Real power didn't need the room to know it was there. She thought about that theory often, later. After everything. Because Baek Gyo-won was the quietest man she had ever met. And she had been right about what that meant, and completely wrong about what it would cost her. She met him on a Tuesday in October, at a dinner she almost didn't attend. A colleague's birthday. A restaurant in the kind of neighborhood that made you check your posture walking in. She had come straight from work, still in her blazer, her hair pulled back, already calculating how early she could leave without being rude. She was tired. She had been tired for months, the particular exhaustion of a woman running slightly faster than her life, staying just ahead of the feeling that she was doing everything right and still somehow falling behind. She found her table. She sat down. She looked up. He was 2 tables away, not looking at her, or so she thought. Dark suit. Naughty. A stillness about him that most people would have read as arrogance. She read it differently. She had always been good at reading rooms, at locating the thing underneath the surface of a thing. And what she read in him, in that first unguarded second before he knew she was watching, was not arrogance. It was exhaustion. The same kind she was carrying. He noticed her noticing. He didn't smile. He didn't perform. He simply held her gaze for 1 beat longer than a stranger should, and then looked away. And Amaria, who had a policy about men like that, men who were too composed, too certain, too comfortable taking up space, felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Curious. She didn't speak to him that night. Neither did he. But the mutual acquaintance who'd invited her to the dinner mentioned his name in passing, and Amaria filed it away without examining why. 3 weeks later, he appeared at a gallery opening she attended for work. He was across the room. He saw her immediately. This time, he crossed it. He didn't open with charm. He didn't flatter her. He stood beside her in front of a painting she'd been staring at for 10 minutes and said, quietly, "You look like you're trying to decide if you actually like it or if you've just been told you should." She had laughed before she could stop herself. Because he was right. That was how it started. Not with his money or his reputation. She didn't know the full weight of either yet. It started with a sentence that saw her clearly. And Amaria, who had spent her whole life being capable and competent and impressively fine, was undone by the simple experience of being accurately read. They were careful with each other at first. She asked questions. He answered some of them and was honest about the ones he wouldn't. She respected that more than she should have. There was a version of him she was allowed access to, warm, dry-humored, genuinely curious about her mind, and she loved that version with everything she had. He came to her apartment and cooked badly and didn't pretend otherwise. He listened to her talk about her work with the focused attention of someone who was actually interested. He remembered small things. The name of her childhood best friend. The way she took her tea. That she always read the last page of a book first because she couldn't stand not knowing where she was headed. She should have noticed what that last one meant about her. She was not, it turned out, as good at applying her own observations to herself. His world revealed itself slowly. Not all at once. Piece by piece, the way a tide pulls back to show you the shape of the sea floor. Not dramatically, just steadily, until one day she looked down and realized how far the water had receded and how exposed everything was. The men who appeared and disappeared. The calls he stepped outside to take. The nights he came to her already carrying something heavy that he would never name. She asked once, directly. He told her enough to be honest and not enough to be dangerous. She told herself that was acceptable. For a while, she believed it. What she could not have anticipated was Malachi. Not the fact of him. She had wanted children, she knew that. But the way becoming his mother reorganized everything inside her. The way she looked at the world Beck operated in, and for the first time saw it not as complicated or morally grey or the price of loving a man who was more than one thing, but as a place her son would grow up if she stayed. A place with rules she didn't make and couldn't change. A place where the quiet kind of power she had once admired could turn, without warning, into something that got people killed. She started paying closer attention after that. And the more clearly she saw it, the less she could unsee it. She didn't leave angry. That was the part people never understood about women like her. She left decided. There's a difference. Anger passes. Decisions don't. She packed what mattered. She took her boy. She didn't look back. Not because it didn't hurt. Because she already knew if she looked back, she would stay. The night she decided to leave, Beck made her favorite meal. That was the part that stayed with her longest afterward. Not the argument that came before it, not the phone call she wasn't supposed to hear, not the thing his associate had said in the hallway that Beck didn't know she'd caught. All of that had been building for months. What broke her was the meal. Jollof rice, the way her mother used to make it, a recipe he had quietly learned from her aunt without telling her, presented on a Tuesday evening like a peace offering for a war he didn't know she'd already decided to stop fighting. She had sat down. She had eaten. She had smiled at him across the table and felt, with a clarity that was almost gentle, that she was already gone. Malachi was 14 months old. He was asleep in the next room, the particular heavy sleep of a toddler who had exhausted himself completely, his small chest rising and falling with a steadiness that she checked on 3, 4, 5 times a night because the world felt less predictable than it used to. That was the thing about becoming a mother that no one had warned her about adequately. Not the love, everyone warned you about the love, but the fear. The sudden, irreversible awareness that you had handed the largest part of yourself to a person who could not yet protect it. That everything you did from this point forward was either making his world safer or it wasn't. She had been doing the calculation for weeks. Quietly, the way she did everything important. Adding it up column by column in the back of her mind while she smiled and cooked and lay beside Beck in the dark listening to him breathe. What Malachi would understand at 5. At 10. At 17. What questions he would ask. What answers she would have to give. What shape the life around him would have taken by then, and whose hands would have built it. The phone call she'd overheard that afternoon had not been the worst thing she'd ever heard in Beck's orbit. That was almost what frightened her. She had listened to it from the hallway, Malachi on her hip, and registered it with a steadiness that told her she had been absorbing things like this for long enough that they no longer shocked her. She had been in the process of being changed by this world without noticing. And her son was being held by a woman who was already different from the one who had walked into that gallery 2 years ago. That was the moment. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a woman standing in a hallway with a child on her hip, understanding that she had been slowly handing herself over in pieces, and that she needed to stop before there was nothing left to give Malachi that was fully hers. She waited until he was asleep. She moved through the apartment with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been rehearsing this in their mind for long enough that the physical version felt almost familiar. She took Malachi's things first. That was important to her, that she was thorough for him even when her hands weren't quite steady. The small blue blanket he couldn't sleep without. 3 changes of clothes. His bear with the worn ear. She packed her own things second and with less care, because she mattered less in this equation than she used to. She did not take anything that was his. Not the jewelry, not the money he kept in the drawer of the bedside table, not the emergency card he had put in her name 2 months after Malachi was born. She left all of it. She needed the exit to be clean. She needed to be able to say, to herself if no one else, that she had taken only what was hers. She wrote nothing. She had drafted a note 4 times in her head over the previous week and deleted every version because none of them were honest enough and all of them were too honest, and there was no version that said what she actually meant, which was, I love you and I cannot stay, and both of those things are completely true and I'm sorry that they are. She picked Malachi up without waking him. He stirred, made a small sound, then settled against her shoulder with the absolute trust of a child who has never had a reason to doubt that he is held. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom for 4 seconds. She looked at Beck sleeping. She memorized him the way you memorize something you know you are about to lose. Not the version she had argued with or worried about or lain awake beside, but the original one. The man from the gallery. The one who had cooked badly and remembered small things and seen her clearly before she'd given him any reason to. She let herself feel that for 4 seconds. Then she turned around and walked out. The door closed behind her with a sound so small it barely registered. The elevator came. The lobby was empty. The street outside was cool and dark and indifferent, the way cities are at that hour, still moving, still alive, not pausing for anyone's grief. She did not cry until she was in the car. And even then, she gave herself exactly 1 block. Because Malachi was still asleep on her shoulder. And he needed a mother who was already looking forward. So she looked forward. The apartment was small enough that she knew every sound it made. The pipe behind the bathroom wall that knocked twice every morning at 6. The 3rd stair from the top that creaked under her left foot but not her right. The way the kitchen window rattled when the wind came from the north, which it did most of November, which meant most of November she wedged a folded piece of cardboard into the frame and told herself she would ask the landlord to fix it and never did. She knew the apartment the way you know something you have chosen to make yours. Not because it was perfect but because it was hers, completely, with no negotiation and no compromise and no one else's preferences built into the walls. She had chosen it for the light. 2nd floor, east-facing, and in the mornings when the sun came through the window above the kitchen sink, it fell across the counter in a way that made even the ordinary business of making breakfast feel like something warmer. She had stood in that kitchen on the first morning and held Malachi on her hip and thought, this is enough. This is a place where something good can happen. She had needed to believe that. So she did. The first year was the hardest in the ways she had expected and easier in the ways she hadn't. She had anticipated the exhaustion, the money stretched to its edges, the particular loneliness of building something from nothing in a city that doesn't slow down to help you. What she hadn't anticipated was how clean it would feel. How much of her energy she got back once she stopped spending it on vigilance. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding herself until she didn't have to anymore, and the unclenching was so gradual she almost missed it, until one morning she woke up before Malachi and lay in the quiet and realized her first thought had not been about something to worry about. It had just been about the day. That was new. She held it carefully, like something that might startle and leave. Malachi walked at 13 months. He did it the way he did most things. Quietly, without fanfare, simply deciding one afternoon that he was ready and then being ready. She had been folding laundry on the couch when she looked up and he was standing in the middle of the room, not holding anything, looking at her with an expression of absolute concentration. Then he took 3 steps toward her and sat down hard and looked surprised at himself. She laughed so suddenly it scared him, and then he laughed too, not knowing why, just catching it from her, and she picked him up and held him tighter than the moment strictly required because she was so full of something she couldn't name. Pride, yes. But also something lonelier than pride. The particular ache of a good moment witnessed by only one person. She called her mother. She didn't call anyone else. He started talking not long after. Single words first, her name, which he said as Mama, and then, with growing confidence, Ma, which she found she preferred. Then objects, then demands, then observations, which was when she understood she was raising someone with an unusually precise attention to the world around him. He noticed things. He remembered them. He would return to a question 3 days after she thought he'd forgotten it, with the same directness as if no time had passed. He was 2.5 when he first asked about his father. Not in those words. He was too young for those words. What he said was, "Where's my daddy?" in the uncomplicated way children ask for things they have simply noticed are absent, the same tone he used to ask where his blanket was or where the sun went at night. Amaria had been ready for the question in theory. She had rehearsed versions of the answer for months, had turned it over in the shower and on the walk to the childminder and in the 15 minutes before sleep when the mind goes wherever it wants regardless of permission. She said, "He lives somewhere else. But he loves you." She kept her voice even. She kept her face open. She gave him the version of the truth that was true enough for 2.5. He seemed satisfied. He moved on. Children do. But he came back. He always came back. Each time with a question that was slightly more specific than the last, as though he was building something piece by piece, gathering information with the patience of someone who understood that the full picture would arrive eventually and was content to wait for it. Where does he live? What does he look like? Does he know about me? Why doesn't he come? She answered what she could. She was honest about what she couldn't. She said I don't know when she didn't know, and that's complicated when the truth was too large for the moment, and she watched his face carefully each time, looking for damage, finding instead a child who was processing information rather than drowning in it. He was resilient in a way that awed her. She didn't know yet if that was his nature or something she had given him without realizing. She hoped it was both. At night, after he was asleep, she would sit at the kitchen table with her tea going cold and the apartment quiet around her, and she would not think about Beck. She was disciplined about this. She had things to do, bills to review, shifts to arrange, the small administrative work of a life run on tight margins. She focused on those things. She was thorough. She was efficient. And when she was done, and the list was finished, and there was nothing left to redirect her attention toward, she thought about him anyway. Not with longing, exactly. Not with regret. Something more complicated than either. The thought of him had become a room inside her that she didn't live in but couldn't quite close off. She would stand at the door of it sometimes, in those late quiet minutes, and take stock of what was still there. The way he held his glass. The 4 seconds in the doorway. The meal he had cooked with a recipe he had quietly learned from someone who loved her. Then she would close the door. And go to bed. And wake up the next morning and make breakfast in the good light and be, without performance, the mother her son needed. She did this for 3 years. She was very good at it. She was also very tired. It started the way the worst things always do, quietly, and then all at once. Malachi had been off for 2 days. Not dramatically, not in a way that cleared the room or demanded immediate action. Just slightly less himself. A little quieter at dinner. Less interested in the show he normally negotiated hard to stay up for. She had touched his forehead on Tuesday morning and found it warm but not alarming, and she had done what mothers who cannot afford to panic do. She had noted it, monitored it, kept him home from school, and told herself it was the thing going around. There was always something going around. She had given him water and fruit and extra sleep and checked on him 4 times in the night, and by Wednesday morning he had seemed better. Brighter. He had asked for pancakes with the specific authority of a child who knows he has been unwell and intends to leverage it appropriately. She had made them. She had felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. By Wednesday evening the fever was back. Higher this time. She gave him something for it and sat on the edge of his bed and read to him until he fell asleep, and she stayed a little longer than necessary, watching him in the dim light, doing the calculation she always did. Is this the normal kind of worry, or the other kind? She decided it was the normal kind. She went to bed. At 2 a.m. she heard a sound she had never heard from him before. She was in his room before she was fully awake. He was on his side, shaking, his small body rigid and then loose and then rigid again, his eyes not quite focused, not quite present. She knew what she was seeing. Some part of her brain named it with a terrible calm even as the rest of her was already moving. Calling the ambulance, pulling him gently onto his back, speaking to him in a low steady voice because she had read once that you should talk to them and she could not remember anything else from that article except that one thing, so she talked. She said his name. She said I'm here. Mama's here. I've got you. She said it on a loop, like a frequency he could locate her on, while her hands shook and her voice did not. The ambulance came in 7 minutes. It felt like a country. The hospital received them with the particular organized urgency of a place that has seen everything and has systems for all of it. People spoke to her in careful, clear sentences. She answered everything correctly. She knew this because she was monitoring herself from a slight distance, the way you do when your body understands that falling apart is not currently an option. She signed what they put in front of her. She answered the questions about his history, his medications, any previous episodes. She sat in the chair they pointed her to, and she waited. The doctor was young, which surprised her, and precise, which helped. He sat down beside her rather than standing over her, and she noticed that and was grateful for it without having the bandwidth to say so. He explained what they had found. A febrile seizure, likely, common, often singular, usually not a sign of something more serious. But Malachi's fever had spiked higher than it should have, and there was something in his blood work they wanted to look at more closely. There was a window, he said. A short one, within which certain things needed to be determined and certain decisions potentially made. He used the word precautionary more than once. She understood that this was meant to be reassuring. She also understood that doctors used that word carefully, in the same way people said fine when they meant not fine yet, but I need you to stay calm while we find out. She thanked him. He left. She sat in the hallway alone. The corridor was white and long and smelled of the specific antiseptic that she would smell in her dreams for years afterward. A nurse moved past. A trolley wheeled by. Somewhere further down the hall, a television was on at low volume. The world was continuing to function with complete indifference to the fact that her son was in a room she couldn't see, and she was sitting in a plastic chair that was bolted to the floor as though the hospital understood that some people needed things around them to be fixed in place. She looked at her hands. They had stopped shaking. She wasn't sure when. She thought about who she could call. Her mother, yes, she would call her mother. Her colleague who had a key to the apartment. These were the calls she could make. These were the people in the architecture of the life she had built. She went through them methodically and understood, at the end of the list, that there was a gap in it that no one on the list could fill. A gap she had designed deliberately. That she had considered the cost of and paid it anyway. She understood, sitting in that hallway, that being strong was not the same as being sufficient. That she had confused the two for 3 years. That her son was in that room and the decision coming was not one she could carry alone. Not because she wasn't capable, but because Malachi deserved more than her capability. He deserved every resource available to him. He deserved both. She opened her phone. She found the number she had never deleted. She had told herself she kept it for emergencies. She had known, on some level below justification, that this was true. She typed 7 words. She read them back once. She pressed send. She put the phone face down on her thigh. She looked at the white wall opposite. She breathed in. She breathed out. She did not know if he would come. She did not know what it would mean if he didn't. She did not know what it would mean if he did. Both answers frightened her in different ways, for different reasons, and she sat with both of them in that cold bright hallway and did not look away from either. She was still sitting there 20 minutes later when her phone lit up with a single word. Coming. She read it. She nodded once, to no one. She put the phone back down. And for the first time since she had heard that sound at 2 a.m. and run to her son's room, Amaria Sloane Ashwood allowed herself to cry. Baek Gyo-won had not always been this still. There had been a version of him, before the weight of the syndicate settled fully onto his shoulders, that was capable of something approaching looseness. Not warmth exactly, that had never been his natural register, but a kind of ease. A willingness to occupy a room without surveilling it. His mother had photographs from that time that she kept on the shelf in her sitting room, and on the rare occasions he visited she would watch him look at them with the expression of a man examining evidence of someone else's life. He had taken over at 29. Not by choice, not entirely. There are inheritances you are handed and inheritances you are conscripted into, and his had been the second kind, dressed up as the first. The syndicate required a particular type of person at its head. Patient. Unreadable. Capable of making decisions that most people would spend years recovering from, and then having dinner afterward without the food tasting different. He had learned to be that person with the same methodical precision he applied to everything. He had not enjoyed the learning. He had done it anyway. By 32, it was no longer learning. It was just who he was. His organization ran on his stillness. The men around him calibrated themselves to it the way instruments calibrate to a fixed point, using his composure as the baseline for what was manageable and what was not. If Beck was still, the situation was under control. If Beck moved quickly, you moved with him and asked nothing. In 7 years of running the syndicate, he had raised his voice exactly once. He had not needed to raise it since. There were men in his organization who had worked alongside him for years and could not have told you the color of his eyes, because meeting them directly was not something you did without reason. This was the architecture of the life he had built. Precise, load-bearing, and designed to require nothing from him that he was not prepared to give. He did not talk about Amaria. This was not a rule he had announced. He had not needed to. The people around him understood the shape of the silence the way you understand the shape of a room in the dark, by moving carefully around what you cannot see. His second, a man named Cho who had been with him for 6 years and understood him better than most, had mentioned her name once, in the first weeks after she left, offering information he thought Beck might want. Beck had looked at him with an expression Cho could not fully interpret and said nothing. Cho had not mentioned her again. Neither had anyone else. What Beck did with the 3 years was work. This was not avoidance, or not only avoidance. The syndicate genuinely required the level of attention he gave it, and he gave it everything, and the results were the kind that compounded. Expanded operations. Cleaner books. A legitimate portfolio that was beginning to outperform the parts of the business that existed in the gray. He was building something that could, in a decade, be entirely above ground. He told himself this was vision. He knew, in the honest part of himself he visited rarely, that it was also penance. That he was constructing something worth leaving to a son he had never met, who lived in a city he had located within a week of Amaria's departure and then deliberately not visited, because she had made her decision and he understood what it had cost her and he owed her enough to let it stand. He had a photograph. One. Taken by someone in his employ who he had not explicitly asked to take it, and who had exercised a judgment Beck had neither confirmed nor punished. Malachi at 18 months, outside a grocery store, in a yellow coat, holding Amaria's hand and looking at something off to the left with an expression of complete absorption. Beck kept it in the inside pocket of his second jacket. Not the one he wore most often. The one he wore when he needed to remember what the work was for. He did not look at it often. When he did, he put it away quickly. The meeting on the night the text arrived had been running for 2 hours and had at least one more to go. 8 figures on the table. 3 interested parties with partially competing interests. Beck had been in the process of navigating the competing interests toward a position that served his own when his phone moved against the table with the particular vibration he had designated for a small number of contacts. He glanced at it. A habit, not an intention. The kind of glance that normally registered and returned to the room in under a second. He read the number first. Then he read the words. Your son is sick. Come now. The room continued. Someone was making a point about the northern accounts. Beck read the message a second time, not because he had misunderstood it, but because his mind was doing something it almost never did. It was stalling. Buying itself a moment before it had to process the full weight of what 7 words had just rearranged. He set the phone down. He looked at the table. He looked at the man still speaking about the northern accounts. Then he stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He walked out. No explanation. No instruction. No backward glance at the 8 figures or the 3 parties or the meeting that had needed him 60 seconds ago. Cho followed him into the corridor. Boss. Clear my morning. His voice was the same as always. Steady. Uninflected. Cho looked at his face. Whatever he saw there made him ask nothing further. Beck was already moving toward the exit, his hand in his inside jacket pocket, his fingers finding the edge of a photograph he had looked at less than he should have and never once thrown away. He walked through the lobby and into the night air and got into the car and said the name of the hospital without needing to look it up. Because he had always known which hospital was closest to her apartment. He had known, and he had done nothing with the knowing for 3 years. He was done doing nothing. He arrived 40 minutes after the text. She knew it was him before she saw him. The shift in the hallway was subtle but unmistakable. The way a room adjusts to the introduction of a new pressure system. A nurse glanced up from her station. An orderly who had been moving with casual purpose suddenly moved with slightly more of it. Amaria had her back to the corridor entrance and she felt it anyway, the way you feel a change in temperature, and she sat up straighter in her chair before she had consciously decided to. Then he was there. He looked exactly the same. That was the first thing she registered, and it landed with an unfairness she hadn't prepared for. 3 years, and he looked exactly the same, immaculate suit, unhurried movement, that quality of stillness that she had once found steadying and now found, in this white corridor with her son in a room down the hall, simply infuriating. She had aged 3 years. She had the night shifts and the tight budget and the solo parenting written somewhere on her, she was sure of it. He looked like time had simply declined to touch him. His eyes found her immediately. They did what they always did, read her fully in a single pass, and then he crossed the corridor and stopped in front of her and said her name. Not a greeting. Just her name, in a tone she couldn't immediately categorize. Where is he? Down the hall. He's stable. She stood because sitting felt like a disadvantage she couldn't afford. The doctor. I've spoken to the doctor. She paused. When? On the way here. He said it without apology, which was characteristic, and without apparent awareness that it might require one, which was also characteristic. I've arranged for a specialist to come in the morning. Pediatric neurologist, the best in the city. And there's a private room available on the 3rd floor that. Malachi has a room. A private room. With better monitoring equipment and. Beck. She said his name the way you stop a sentence. He has a room. He's sleeping. He's stable. I don't need you to upgrade him like he's a hotel booking. Something moved across his face and was gone. I'm trying to help. I know what you're trying to do. She kept her voice low because they were in a hospital and because Malachi was down the hall and because she had promised herself on the drive over in the ambulance that she would not do this. That she would be practical and civil and focused on her son and nothing else. What I'm asking you to do is slow down. He doesn't need more resources in the next 10 minutes. He needs to sleep. Beck looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. A concession that cost him something, she could tell, though he would never say so. She sat back down. After a brief pause, he sat beside her. Not close. One chair between them, which felt both insufficient and oddly formal. The hallway hummed its quiet hospital hum around them. Somewhere a monitor beeped a steady rhythm. Tell me what happened. His voice was different now. Stripped of the logistics. She told him. All of it, from the 2 days of low-grade fever to the sound she'd heard at 2 a.m. to the 7 minutes for the ambulance to arrive that had felt like a geography. She told it plainly, without editorializing, in the same tone she had used with the doctors because it was the only tone she currently trusted herself with. He listened without interrupting, which she had forgotten he was good at. He had always been good at listening. It was the responding that had been the problem. When she finished he was quiet for a moment. You were alone. I'm always alone. She hadn't meant to say it like that. Not with that particular weight on it. She felt him absorb it and chose not to look at his face. They sat without speaking for a minute that had too much in it. Then a small voice came from the direction of Malachi's room. Mama. She was up immediately, Beck half a step behind her, and they came through the door to find Malachi awake, sitting up against his pillow with the slightly confused expression of a child recalibrating to an unfamiliar room. He looked at Amaria first, and the confusion settled into relief. Then he looked past her. His eyes found Beck and stayed there. Amaria watched her son look at his father for the first time, and felt something move through her that she could not have named at gunpoint. Malachi was 4 years old and had his father's eyes and his father's stillness and had apparently inherited along with both the same quality of attention, that focused, unhurried appraisal that took its time and reached its own conclusions. Beck had gone very quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. This was not composure. This was a man absorbing something he had not been prepared for, which was the particular experience of having a small person look at you like they already know you. Are you my dad? Malachi asked. The question was direct and simple and landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Beck crouched down to his level. It was the right instinct, Amaria noted distantly. He crouched down, and he looked at his son, and he said, with a steadiness that she suspected cost him considerably, yes. I am. Malachi considered this. You took a long time, he said. Amaria looked at the wall. She could not look at either of them. I know, Beck said. I'm sorry. Malachi seemed to find this acceptable. He looked at his mother. Can he stay? She looked at her son's face. Then briefly, at the man crouched beside his bed. Then back at Malachi. For tonight, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not a beginning. It was simply the only answer her son's face left her room to give. The specialist arrived at 7 in the morning. Amaria had not slept. She was aware of this the way you are aware of weather, as a condition of the environment rather than a choice. She had sat in the chair beside Malachi's bed through the night, dozing in 20-minute fragments and surfacing each time with the same immediate inventory, his breathing, his color, the steady green line on the monitor. Beck had stayed. He had taken the chair on the other side of the bed without asking, and she had not told him to leave, and somewhere around 4 in the morning she had looked across at him and found him awake, watching Malachi with an expression she had no framework for because she had never seen it on him before. She had looked away before he noticed. The specialist was thorough and serious and used precise language that Amaria appreciated and found simultaneously terrifying. The inflammation markers in Malachi's bloodwork had not decreased overnight the way they had hoped. There was a possibility, not a certainty, the specialist was careful about this, of a condition that would require intervention. There was a procedure. Low risk by clinical standards, which Amaria understood meant risk was still present, just smaller than the alternative. There was a window. 48 hours, perhaps less, within which the intervention would be most effective. After that window, the calculus changed. The specialist left them with paperwork and the particular silence of a room that has just been handed something heavy. Malachi was asleep again. The morning light came through the window at a low angle and fell across the foot of his bed. Amaria stood at the window with her back to the room and looked at the city going about its morning and tried to locate, somewhere in herself, the steady place she always went to when decisions needed to be made. It was harder to find than usual. It kept slipping. We should consent to the procedure. Beck's voice, behind her. I know. The window. I know about the window. She turned around. I was in the room. I heard him. Then what are we discussing? We're not discussing anything yet. I'm thinking. There's nothing to think about. The risk of the procedure is significantly lower than. Beck. She stopped, steadied herself. I understand the risk assessment. I'm his mother. I have been making risk assessments about his life for 4 years, alone, without a second opinion, without anyone to check my thinking at 2 in the morning when I wasn't sure. I know how to do this. What I'm asking for is 60 seconds to think before I sign something. Can you give me that? The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. This one had edges. I'm trying to help, he said. It was the same thing he had said the night before. But this time there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Something that sounded less like certainty and more like a man who only had one tool and knew it. You keep saying that. Her voice was quiet. They were in the corridor now. She wasn't sure when that had happened, both of them having moved by unspoken agreement away from Malachi's room. You've been here for 8 hours and you've spoken to 3 doctors and arranged a specialist and offered a private room, and I understand that's what helping looks like to you. I do. But it has never. She stopped. She looked at the floor. She felt the thing she had carried for 3 years moving toward the surface, and she made a decision she had not planned to make. She let it come. It has never felt like love. It has always felt like management. Like I was a situation you were handling. And I spent 2 years trying to tell you that, and I could never find a way to make you hear it, and eventually I stopped trying because I was so tired, Beck. I was so tired of being the only one who was fighting for what we were. You were always solving and you were never just there. You were never just present with me. And I needed that. I needed that, and I couldn't make you understand, and so I left. And it was the right thing. I still believe it was the right thing. But I need you to know that it cost me. I need you to know what I paid. She had not planned to say any of it. All of it was true. She looked up. She had been half expecting the wall, the composure, the deflection, the controlled non-response she had spent years trying to penetrate. She had her next words ready for it. He didn't give her the wall. Baek Gyo-won stood in a hospital corridor in yesterday's suit with his son 20 feet away and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him in 3 years together and said, without defending himself, without qualifying, without managing the moment into something more comfortable, "You're right. All of it. You're right." She said nothing. She hadn't expected that. She didn't have words for that. "I didn't know how to be what you needed." His voice was steady, but it cost him. She could hear what it cost him. "I knew something was wrong and I kept thinking I could fix the wrongness by doing more. By solving the next thing. I didn't understand that what you needed wasn't solutions." He paused. "I understood it the morning I woke up and you were gone. I understood it completely. And there was nothing I could do with the understanding because you were already." He stopped. He looked at the wall briefly, then back at her. "I let you go because you deserved someone who had understood it before you left. I didn't think I had the right to ask you to come back." The corridor hummed around them. Somewhere a door opened and closed. Amaria looked at this man she had loved and left and thought about every night she had sat at a kitchen table and closed a door inside herself and chosen the morning. She thought about Malachi asking you took a long time with the simple accuracy of a child who doesn't know yet that some truths are supposed to be softened. She thought about the 48-hour window. About the paperwork on the table in the room behind her. About the fact that her son needed both of them, steadily, without the weight of this thing unresolved between them contaminating every decision. "I'm going to go sign the consent forms," she said. He nodded. "And then I need you to sit with him while I sleep for 2 hours. Because I haven't slept and I need to be present for him and I can't do that without sleep." "Okay. That's what I need from you right now. Not the specialist. Not the private room. Just sit with your son." "Okay," he said again. Quieter this time. She looked at him for one more moment. "We're not fixed," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know. But I heard you." She turned and walked back toward the room. She didn't look back. But for the first time in 3 years, the not looking back felt different. Not like escape. Not like survival. Just like a woman who finally knew where she was going. The procedure took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Amaria knew this because she counted. Not continuously. She was not the kind of woman who watched a clock with open desperation that felt too much like a surrender to the fear, but periodically, the way you check a wound. A glance at the time to establish that the world was still moving in the right direction. That the minutes were adding up rather than stopping. She had slept for 90 minutes before they took him down. Beck had sat with Malachi as she'd asked, and she had taken the chair in the small family room at the end of the corridor and closed her eyes and told her body that this was not optional, that she needed it to cooperate, and her body, exhausted enough to comply, had gone under quickly and completely. She had woken with no transition, just the sudden full return to consciousness and the first thought, immediate and total, Malachi. Beck was in the corridor when she came out. He told her they would be taking him down in 30 minutes. He said it straightforwardly, no softening, no management. She had asked him to be present rather than efficient, and he was trying. She could see the trying. It looked unfamiliar on him, like a man wearing clothes cut for someone else, not badly, just not yet broken in. They had sat together in the waiting area outside the surgical suite. Not speaking. The quality of the silence was different from the silences before. Less armored, somehow. Whatever had been said in the corridor had not fixed anything, she had meant that, but it had changed the atmospheric pressure between them. The silence no longer felt like two people withholding. It felt like two people who had said the hard thing and were now simply sitting inside the aftermath of having said it, letting it settle. A nurse had brought tea without being asked. Amaria had held the cup without drinking from it until it went cold. At the 2-hour mark, the surgeon appeared. Her expression was the professionally neutral kind that Amaria had learned in the last 48 hours to read carefully, and what she read in it, in the slight release around the eyes, was before the woman spoke a single word: good news. The procedure had gone well. Malachi was in recovery. He would be groggy, he would be tired, he would need monitoring for the next 24 hours, but the inflammation was responding and the intervention had achieved what they had needed it to achieve. He was going to be fine. Amaria nodded. She thanked the surgeon. She kept her face composed until the surgeon walked away, and then she put her face in her hands for 10 seconds and breathed. Just breathed. Beck sat beside her and did not touch her and did not speak, and it was, she would think later, exactly the right thing. The space to feel it without it being redirected or absorbed or managed into something more comfortable for someone else. 10 seconds. Then she straightened. Then they went to find their son. Malachi was back in his room by the time they reached him, transferred from recovery with the careful efficiency of a hospital that had done this thousands of times. He was asleep. Deeply, heavily, the sleep of a body that had been through something and was now doing the serious work of repair. He looked small against the pillow. He looked, she thought, extraordinarily like himself, that particular Malachi-ness that she had been terrified of losing, still entirely present, just resting. She stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment. Then she pulled the blanket up slightly, smoothed it, and stepped back. She looked at Beck. He was looking at Malachi with that expression again, the one she had no framework for, the one that was not his composure and not its absence, but something she was beginning to understand was a third thing entirely. What his face did when it forgot to perform either. "I'll get some water," she said quietly. He nodded without looking up. She was gone for perhaps 20 minutes. The hospital had a small cafe 2 floors down that was just opening its early service, and she bought water and something to eat that she needed but didn't want. And she stood at the window for a few minutes watching the city in the early morning light. Letting herself exist outside the room briefly. Letting her nervous system begin, cautiously, the long process of standing down. When she came back, the room was dim. Someone had lowered the blinds against the morning glare. Malachi was still sleeping. Beck was seated in the chair beside the bed. Still in his suit, which he had now been wearing for over 24 hours. His jacket was still on. His posture was still straight, because she suspected there was no version of Beck Gyeowon that did not have straight posture, even in a plastic hospital chair at 6 in the morning after no sleep. But his head was bent slightly forward. And his hand was on the bed, wrapped around Malachi's small fingers with a carefulness that looked like a man handling something he understood to be precious and irreplaceable and his, in a way that nothing else in his life had ever been entirely his. He didn't hear her come in. Or if he did, he didn't move. She stood in the doorway and looked at this. She let herself look at it without flinching, without the protective instinct to categorize it or hold it at a distance or decide what it meant before she had finished feeling it. A man who controlled everything, holding his son's hand in a darkened room, in yesterday's suit, with nothing left to manage. She had spent 3 years being right about leaving. She was still right. The leaving had been necessary and she did not regret it. But she was beginning to understand that 2 things could be true. That she could have been right to go and also be standing in a doorway now, watching something real, feeling the door inside her open without her permission. Not wide, just enough to let in the light. She didn't speak. Neither did he. She crossed the room quietly and sat in the chair on the other side of the bed. She looked at Malachi's face. She let her son's breathing set the rhythm. Slow. Steady. Proof of itself. Outside, the city was waking up. Inside, the 3 of them were still. Not fixed. Not forgiven. Not a family yet, or not in any way that had been agreed upon or named. But in the same room. With the door open. For now, that was enough. The follow-up appointment was on a Thursday, 10 days after the procedure. Amaria had not asked Beck to come. She had sent him the details, the time, the hospital, the name of the specialist, in a text that was purely informational, the kind you send to someone and then put your phone down without waiting to see if they respond. She had told herself she had no expectation either way. That she was simply providing information because he was Malachi's father and he had a right to it. That whatever he did with the information was his business and she had made her peace with both outcomes. He was in the waiting room when they arrived. sitting in one of the chairs along the wall with his phone in his hand, not the posture of someone who had just arrived but someone who had been there long enough to settle. He was wearing a different suit. This one was a slightly softer gray, and she noticed this and then noticed that she had noticed it and looked at Malachi instead. Malachi saw him and said, "Hi, Dad," with the straightforward ease of a child who had apparently decided, in the uncomplicated way children make enormous decisions, that this was simply a fact of his life now. A dad. In a waiting room. Perfectly normal. He walked over and stood beside Beck's chair and began telling him about something that had happened at nursery that week with the focused intensity of someone who had been saving the story. Beck listened. Really listened. His phone went into his pocket. Amaria sat down across the room and watched and said nothing. The appointment went well. The inflammation had continued to reduce. The specialist used the word excellent twice and the word discharged once, and Malachi celebrated this information by asking if excellent meant he could have ice cream, which the specialist found funnier than Amaria had energy to find it, though she smiled anyway because her son was well and the room was warm, and smiling was the correct response to both of those things. In the corridor afterward, Beck asked if he could take Malachi for an hour. He directed the question at her, not at Malachi, which was right. He waited for her answer without filling the silence with reassurances or negotiations. Just asked and waited. She said yes. She spent that hour sitting in a cafe 2 streets from her apartment drinking coffee that was too hot and cooling her hands on the outside of the cup and trying to identify what she was feeling. It wasn't anxiety exactly. It was something more like the feeling of having held a thing tightly for so long that when you finally set it down your hands didn't immediately know what to do with themselves. A loosening that felt strange because the tension had become so familiar. He brought Malachi back at the agreed time. Malachi was carrying a small paper bag and had ice cream on his jacket, which tracked. Beck looked at the ice cream on the jacket with an expression that suggested he was filing this information away for future reference. "Same time next week?" he asked. Meaning the hour, not the appointment. She looked at her son's face, which was asking the same question without words. "Same time next week," she said. That was how it started. Not with a conversation or an agreement or anything that was formally established. Just a pattern, emerging. The Thursday follow-ups that became Thursday afternoons. The Thursday afternoons that quietly extended. A school pickup arranged for a Wednesday when she had a work conflict, and he arrived on time and texted her a photograph of Malachi walking out of the gate in his small backpack that she looked at 3 times that evening for no reason she examined. A Sunday in the park that had not been planned, that had simply happened because they were both there and Malachi wanted to show his father the particular tree he considered his. She watched. She did not test. That had never been her nature, and she understood that testing was a different thing from watching, that one was looking for failure and the other was simply looking. She was simply watching. Waiting to see if the shape of it held under ordinary pressure. Under inconvenience and tiredness, and the Tuesday evenings that had nothing cinematic about them, that required showing up not because the stakes were high but simply because it was Tuesday and he had said he would. It held. Not perfectly. There was a Thursday he was late and a Sunday he had to cancel and a Wednesday phone call that went shorter than Malachi would have liked. But he called back. He rescheduled. He showed up the next time without making the showing up a performance, which was the thing she had been watching for most carefully, whether the consistency would require an audience to sustain itself. It didn't. The Tuesday evenings especially. No ekachin. No reason. Just Beck on her couch with Malachi explaining something at length, and her in the kitchen or the chair nearby, and the ordinary quiet of a life that had enough people in it. It was on a Tuesday, 8 months after the hospital, that she noticed Malachi had fallen asleep. He had been sitting between them, narrating something about a cartoon with the passionate investment he brought to all topics, and then he had simply stopped narrating and listed sideways against Beck's arm with the absolute confidence of a child who has never had a reason to doubt that whatever he leans against will hold. Beck had gone still. He looked down at his son, then across at Amaria. She looked back at him over Malachi's sleeping head. Neither of them moved. The television was on low. The apartment was warm. Outside, the city continued its indifferent Tuesday business, not knowing or caring that something small and true was happening in a second-floor apartment with east-facing windows and a kitchen that caught the morning light. There was more still to say between them. There were conversations that hadn't happened yet, and decisions that hadn't been made, and a future that was unwritten in the ways that mattered most. She knew this. So did he. But her son was asleep between them, with the total trust of a child who felt safe. And neither of them was willing to disturb that for anything. So they stayed. There is a version of this story that is about a powerful man. The title suggests it. The setup invites it. A Korean mafia boss, feared by everyone, walks into a hospital and moves things with his money and his name and his network of people who answer on the first ring. That version of the story is tidier. It has a cleaner shape. The powerful man arrives. The powerful man fixes it. The woman who was strong enough to survive alone is rewarded for her strength by being chosen by someone extraordinary. That is not this story. This story is about a woman who spent 3 years being strong in a way that was also, quietly, a form of hiding. Who built walls she called boundaries and called that healing. Who loved her son so completely and so well that she forgot, somewhere in the daily work of it, that she was also a person who deserved to be fully known. Amaria Sloan Ashwood was not waiting to be rescued. She was not a woman in a hood walking through cruelty, waiting for someone powerful to notice her dignity. She was a woman who had already saved herself, and then stopped there at the edge of saved, and called it enough. It wasn't enough. She knew that in the kitchen at midnight. She knew it when Malachi asked questions she answered sideways. She knew it in the room she kept inside herself, the one she didn't live in but couldn't close off, the one with his name on the door that she visited and left and visited again for 3 years without ever deciding what to do about it. And this story is about a man who confused control with presence. Who believed that solving the next problem was the same as showing up for the person in front of him. Who let the woman he loved walk out of his life not because he didn't care but because he had spent so long building a version of himself that didn't need anything that he had forgotten how to ask. Baek Gyo-won was not a villain in this story. He was something more ordinary than that and in some ways harder to write. A person who genuinely tried and genuinely fell short and genuinely didn't understand the gap between the two until it was standing in a doorway with a packed bag, and by then the only honorable thing left was to let her go. The crisis did not fix them. That is important to say clearly. Malachi's illness was not a narrative device designed to reunite his parents. It was a terrifying thing that happened to a small child and to the mother who sat alone in a white hallway at 2 in the morning counting the minutes until an ambulance came. The illness removed their excuses. That is all. It took away the distance and the silence and the 3 years of managed non-contact and put them in the same room with no remaining reason to keep avoiding the thing they had never finished saying to each other. The crisis created the condition for honesty. What they did with the honesty was their own. That is the mechanism worth understanding. Because most of us are not waiting for a crisis. Most of us are waiting for something less dramatic and more elusive. The right moment, the right words, the right version of ourselves that is ready enough and healed enough and certain enough to say the real thing to the person who matters most. We are waiting to be sure it won't cost us anything. And so we stay quiet. We call the quiet strength. We call the distance wisdom. We build lives that are solid and functional and held together entirely by our own 2 hands, and we tell ourselves this is what independence looks like. Sometimes it is. And sometimes it is just loneliness with better posture. The bravest thing Amaria did in this entire story was not leave. Leaving was necessary and right and it took courage, but it was also, in part, a thing she was already built for. She knew how to go. She knew how to survive alone. She had been practicing both since before she met him. The bravest thing she did was open her phone at 2 in the morning in a hospital hallway and type 7 words to the person she had spent 3 years not saying his name to. Not because she was certain. Not because she had resolved the feelings or worked through the history or reached a place of clarity about what she wanted. But because her son needed more than her pride could provide, and she loved him more than she feared the cost. That is the whole lesson. It fits in a single sentence if you need it to. The people worth fighting for are not always the ones we fight with. They are the ones we go quiet around. The ones whose names we don't say out loud. The ones we think about at midnight when the list is done and there's nothing left to redirect us. The ones we keep a door open for inside ourselves even when we've told everyone, including ourselves, that the door is closed. Say the real thing. Send the text. Have the conversation you have been rehearsing for years in the shower and then not having because the moment was never quite right. The moment will not become right on its own. You have to make it right by beginning. It will cost you something. That part is true. Honesty with people who matter always does. But on the other side of the cost is a Tuesday evening with the television on low and your son asleep between you and a man who finally understands what showing up actually means, and neither of you moving, because the thing you almost lost and then almost kept losing through pride and silence and the daily small choice to say nothing is right there, real and warm and breathing. And you are not willing to disturb it for anything. That's the story. That's all of it. Now go send the text.